And it's easy to see why. If we essentially believe we're alone in the world and no one else is going to be there to take care of us, we need to be wealthy to survive. How much is enough money? More than we presently have. Will we find happiness in money? No. Let's read the next excerpt. In America, I saw the freest and most enlightened men placed in the happiest circumstances which the world affords. It seems to me as if a cloud habitually hung upon their brow, and I thought them serious and almost sad, even in their pleasures. The chief reason of this contrast is that the former does not think of the ills they endure. The latter are forever brooding over advantages they do not possess. It is strange to see with what feverish ardor the Americans pursue their own welfare, and to watch the vague dread that constantly torments them, lest they should not have chosen the shortest path which may lead to it. A native of the United States clings to this world's good as if he were certain never to die. But he is so hasty in grasping it all within his reach that one would suppose he was constantly afraid of not living long enough to enjoy them. He clutches everything, he holds nothing fast, but soon loosens his grip to pursue fresh gratifications. In the United States, a man builds a house to spend his later years in it and sells it before the roof is on. He plants a garden and lets it just as the trees are coming into bearing. He brings a field into tillage and leaves other men to gather the crops. He embraces a profession and gives it up. He settles in a place which he soon afterward leaves to carry his changeable longings elsewhere. If his private affairs leave him any leisure, he instantly plunges into the vortex of politics. And if at the end of a year of unremitting labor, he finds he has a few days' vacation, his eager curiosity whirls him over the vast extent of the United States, and he'll travel 1,500 miles in a few days to shake off his happiness. Death at length overtakes him, but is before he is worthy of his bootless chase, of that complete felicity which is forever on the wing. At first sight, there is something surprising in this strange unrest of so many happy men, restless in the midst of abundance. The spectacle itself, however, is old as the world. The novelty is to see a whole people furnish an exemplification of it. Their taste for physical gratifications must be regarded as the original source of that secret inquietude which the actions of the Americans betray, and of that inconstancy of which they afford fresh examples every day. He who has set his heart exclusively upon the pursuit of worldly welfare is always in a hurry, for he has but limited time at his disposal to reach it, to grasp it, and to enjoy it. The recollection of the brevity of life is a constant spur to him. Besides the good things which he possesses, he instantly fancies 1,000 others which death will prevent him from trying if he does not try them soon. This thought fills him with anxiety, fear, and regret, and keeps his mind in ceaseless trepidation, which leads him perpetually to change his plans and his abode. In addition to the taste for physical well-being, a social condition be superadded, in which the laws and customs make no condition permanent. Here is a great additional stimulant to the restlessness of temper. Men will then be seen to continually change their track for fear of missing the shortest cut to happiness. It may be readily conceived that if men, passionately bent upon physical gratifications, desire eagerly, they are also easily discouraged, as their ultimate object is to enjoy. The means to reach that object must be prompt and easy, or the trouble of acquiring the gratification would be greater than the gratification itself. Their prevailing frame of mind then is at once ardent and relaxed, violent and enervated. Death is often less dreaded than perseverance and continuous effort to one end. Does this remind you of a nation you know? he argues that we're going to be a very present tense people. Ten years ago, people were wondering why people in the United States weren't concerned about the environment. And my argument back to them is that it wasn't a present tense issue. And Tocqueville argues that we don't listen to our ancestors and we don't pay attention to our posterity, those who are to come. We only pay attention to ourselves and to ourselves alone. So in the United States, we have a $28 trillion national debt. And the Social Security Trust Fund is going to run out of money in 11 years. And at that point, your generation is going to be forced to either pay higher taxes or cut the benefits that come to my generation. And if I was in your generation, I'd be marching on Washington, D.C. because my generation has run up this debt, and we aren't paying for it. But it's going to be upon you guys to pay for it. And that seems to me to be fundamentally unfair. But Tocqueville argued that that's how we would think. We would think present tense. Senator John McCain said, when it came to the budget deficit, Congress would only act when it ran out of good options. I mean, Congress wasn't going to act unless it was front and center, a crisis right in front of us now. And even if it's 11 years off, we're not going to pay attention to it. Even though we know it's coming, we're not going to pay attention to it. So Tocqueville argues that if we live in a democracy, it changes how we treat each other. Manners. So let's continue to read. An American, instead of going in a leisure hour to dance merrily at some place of public resort, as the fellows of his calling continue to do throughout the greater part of Europe, shuts himself up at home to drink. He thus enjoys two pleasures. He can go on thinking of his business, and he can get drunk decently by his own fireside. In democracies, men are never stationary. 1,000 chances waft them to and fro, and their life is always the sport of unforeseen, or, so to speak, extemporaneous circumstances. Thus, they are often obliged to do things which they have imperfectly learned, to say things which they imperfectly understand, and devote themselves to work for which they are unprepared by long apprenticeship. In aristocracies, every man has one sole object, which he unceasingly pursues. But among democratic nations, the existence of man is more complex. The same mind will almost always embrace several objects at the same time, and these objects are frequently wholly foreign to each other, as it cannot know them all well. The mind is readily satisfied with imperfect notions of each. When the inhabitants of democracy is not urged by his wants, he is at least by his desires. For of all the possessions which he sees around him, none are wholly beyond his reach. He therefore does everything in a hurry. He's always satisfied with pretty well, and never pauses more than an instant to consider what he has been doing. His curiosity is at once insatiable and cheaply satisfied, for he cares more to know a great deal quickly than to know anything well. He has no time and but little taste to search the things to the bottom. Thus then, democratic people are grave, because their social and political condition constantly leads them to engage in serious occupations, and they act inconsiderately because they give but little time and attention to each of these occupations. The habit of inattention must be considered as the great bane of the democratic character. So to summarize, Tocqueville argues that if we live in a democracy, it's going to change how we think, it's going to change what we love, it's going to change how we treat others. Now, Tocqueville believed that democracy was the wave of the future. And the reason he believed this was he believed that the idea of equality was going to become something that was going to sweep the world, that people all over the world were going to come to love equality. And as they came to love equality, they were going to embrace democracy. So he wrote Democracy in America to educate the aristocrats of Europe of what he saw was coming. But he argued that democracy contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. He argued that democracy required both equality and freedom to be held in balance in order for it to be healthy. The problem is that because we love equality more than liberty, he argues that in a democracy we're going to gradually lose freedom in the name of equality. He argues we're going to become individualistic and materialistic. And as a result, we're going to cease to become involved in the community. We're going to become more and more focused on ourselves. And we're going to become more and more focused on taking care of ourselves and acquiring personal wealth. He argues that if this is allowed to go unchecked, we're going to lose democracy and our freedom and equality. So what does Tocqueville believe needs to be done? He argued that we needed to keep politics local. We needed to resist the temptation to nationalize everything. We needed to resist the temptation to centralize everything. Because if we, in the name of equality, if we centralize everything, we're going to end up losing freedom. People are going to become less involved in the democracy. The wealthy are going to be able to take over the democracy. And he argues that we're going to end up losing democracy. He argued that we need to try to strengthen public and private associations. So, such as the Kiwanis Club or Rotary. Those are service organizations that serve local communities. And he argued that there was something really important about those institutions. They kept people to be involved with each other. They kept people involved in the community. They kept people involved in making their community a better place. The third thing he believed was the importance of religion to democracy. He said belief in God is indispensable to democracy. Tocqueville is reported to have said, America is great because America is good. If America ceases to be good, it will cease to be great. He argued that religion was important because it got people outside of themselves. And he believed a key argument for religion was the belief in the punishment of the afterlife. Because the idea of democracy is that it requires enough people to do the right thing when nobody's watching. That's literally the meaning of self-government. So if you live in a society and when nobody's watching, if people are doing the wrong things, you need to have a strong government. You need to have a strong police force to keep everything in check. But if you have a society where people are going to do the right thing when nobody's watching, you can have freedom. You don't need a large police force. You don't need a large government. And Tocqueville believed that the idea of religion, belief in God, was a key component of democracy. Let's read the next section. For my own part, I doubt whether man can ever support at the same time complete religious independence and entire public freedom. And I'm inclined to think that if faith be wanting him, he must serve. And if he be free, he must believe. Perhaps, however, this great utility of religion is still more obvious among nations where equality of conditions prevail than amongst others. It must be acknowledged that equality, which brings great benefits into the world, nevertheless suggests to men, as will be shown hereafter, some various dangerous propensities. It tends to isolate them from each other, to concentrate every man's attention on himself, and it lays open the soul to an inordinate love of material gratification. The greatest advantage of religion is to inspire diametrically contrary principles. There is no religion which does not place the object of man's desires above and beyond the treasures of earth, and which does not naturally raise his soul to regions far among those of the senses. Nor is there any which does not impose on man some sort of duties to his kind, and thus draws him at times from the contemplation of himself. This occurs in religions the most false and dangerous. Religious nations are therefore naturally strong on the very point on which democratic nations are weak, which shows of what importance it is for men to preserve their religion as their conditions become more equal. So Tocqueville argues that religion is essential to democracy because there was nothing else that got us out of ourselves more than a belief in God. And Tocqueville is a Christian. He's Catholic. And so he's coming at this from a Christian point of view. The problem, Tocqueville argues, is that democracy tends to undermine religion. What he argues that in democracy, religion tends toward pantheism. Pan means all. Religions are mutually exclusive. Christianity believes that Jesus is the Son of God. Islam believes that Jesus was a prophet, but not as great or as authoritative as Muhammad. Judaism doesn't believe either. Religion only has the power to change what we do when we believe it to be true. But Tocqueville believes that in a democracy, we're going to tend to become pantheistic. So pantheism, God is everywhere. God is in everything. How will this take place? He argues that in a democracy, we're going to fall in love with the idea of equality. And as we think about equality, we'll gradually move from the idea that one religion is right to the idea that all religions are equal. And as we move to the idea that all religions are equal, we're going to cease to believe that any of them are true. But while we could think that none of them are true, Tocqueville is going to say we're going to believe them all to be true, and that each of us are going to become God, deciding right and wrong for ourselves. So Tocqueville believes that these are the three things that we need to do to keep democracy. But he believes that democracy contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. And the seeds of its own destruction are based on the idea of equality. When we embrace equality to the exclusion of liberty, we ended up losing our religion. We end up centralizing our government. We end up losing local engagement. Any questions? So let's turn to the last reading. This is Tocqueville's conclusion. I seek to trace the novel features under which despotism might appear in the world. The first thing that strikes the observation is an innumerable multitude of men, all equal and alike, incessantly endeavoring to procure the petty and paltry pleasures with which they glut their lives. Each of them, living apart, is as a stranger to the fate of all the rest. His children and his private friends constitute to him the whole of mankind. As for the rest of his fellow citizens, he is close to them, but he sees them not. He touches them, but he feels them not. He exists but in himself and for himself alone. And if his kindred still remain to him, he may be said at any rate to have lost his country. Above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power, which takes upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate. That power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood. But it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. It is well content that the people should rejoice, provided they think of nothing but rejoicing. For their happiness, such a government willingly labors, but it chooses to be the sole agent and the only arbiter of that happiness. It provides for their security, foresees and supplies their necessities, facilitates their pleasure, manages their principal concerns, directs their industry, regulates the descent of property, and subdivides their inheritances. What remains but to spare them all the care of thinking and all the trouble of living? Thus, it every day renders the exercise of the free agency of man less useful and less frequent. It circumscribes the will within a narrower range and gradually robs a man of all the uses of himself. The principle of equality has prepared men for these things. It has predisposed men to endure them, and oftentimes to look at them as benefits. Having thus successfully taken each member of the community in its powerful grasp and fashioned them at will, the supreme power then extends its arm over the whole community. It covers the surface of society with a network of small, complicated rules, minute and uniform, through which the most original minds and the most energetic characters cannot penetrate, to rise above the crowd. The will of man is not shattered, but softened, bent, and guided. Men are seldom forced by it to act, but they are constantly restrained from acting. Such a power does not destroy, but it prevents existence. It does not tyrannize, but it compresses, enervates, extinguishes, and stupefies a people, till each nation is reduced to be nothing better than a flock of timid and industrious animals, of which the government is the shepherd. I've always thought that the servitude of the regular, quiet, and gentle kind, which I have just described, might be combined more easily than is commonly believed of some of the outward forms of freedom, and that might even establish itself under the wing of sovereignty of the people. Our contemporaries are constantly excited by two conflicting passions. They want to be led and they wish to remain free. As they cannot destroy either one of the other of these contrary propensities, they strive to satisfy them both at once. They devise a sole, tutelary, and all-powerful form of government, but elected by the people. They combine the principle of centralization and that of popular sovereignty. This gives them a respite. They console themselves for being in tutelage by the reflection that they have chosen their own guardians. Every man allows himself to be put in leading strings because he sees that it is not a person or a class of persons, but the people at large that hold the end of his chain. By this system, the people shake off their state of dependence just long enough to select their master and then relapse into it again. Does this remind you of a nation you know? can you see why Tocqueville is regarded as prophetic? He wrote this in 1830. So what he's saying in this last section is that this is how we're going to lose our democracy. As we end up losing our religion, we centralize power, we don't get involved in public and private associations. What this is going to do is it's going to bring things to a head with people becoming timid, and they're going to become sheep, and the government is going to be the shepherd. And people are going to give up their freedom for government taking care of them. And it's through the democratic process that we're going to elect a dictator that's going to end up taking away our freedom. So he believes that democracy is good. He believes that democracy is the wave of the future. But he also believes that democracy is fragile and contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. So why do I end our time together with this? Rick called me prophetic. He called me a prophet. And after studying Tocqueville, studying Plato, studying Aristotle, studying Calvin, studying Luther, studying Augustine, studying Aquinas, what I perceived was that equality was going to take over America, and that same-sex marriage was going to happen. And so I wrote my book, Sex in the I World. It was published in 2007. And I argued in the book that same-sex marriage was going to sweep our country, and the transgender movement was going to become a real factor in our country. And when I published the book, I got a lot of pushback from Christians who said, oh, it's never going to happen. But it did happen. It has happened. It is happening. So, I look at the world around us and I see that this love of equality is taking over our world. And so that's where I came up with the idea that same-sex marriage was going to become legal and the transgender movement was going to become normalized. And I don't want it to be true, but I believe it will be true. But I believe that the world that we're living in now is a world that can't sustain itself. Economically, we can't sustain ourselves. Morally, I don't believe we can sustain ourselves. I argue we live in a place called the I world. And it's a rip-off of Stephen Jobs' and Apple computer, I admit. But it's the idea that it's all about me. It's all about I. And the world we live in is a world of excessive individualism. But what I believe is that the I world ultimately won't succeed. And what I believe is the world that we're made for is the our world, relationship world. I believe we're made to love the Lord our God with all our mind, heart, and soul, and love our neighbor as ourselves. I believe that we won't find fulfillment in money. We're only going to find fulfillment in relationship. That humans have a desire to love and to be loved. That we're made in the image of God, male and female. He made us. And our world is a world that's economically sustainable because it's a world that isn't based on individualism. Because in order to live as an individual, as we saw from Aristotle, you need to have independent wealth. In order to find happiness, we need to have our needs met. But our wants are insatiable. And so our wants ultimately can't be met. Any questions? What's your biggest takeaway from our time together?
I feel like I already kind of knew all this was coming. So I feel like we're just going over very
I really enjoyed going over the different views and such positions of Christian culture. I think that it was really well broken down and presented, and I kind of agree that there are certain parts of them that can be true, but I mostly agree with the Christ transform.
Mhm.
I really like that section.
I agree with Maria, but also just the one little phrase it says you said was like giving the apple back to God, and like what that looks like in our own lives, and how like that's when we can be content in God completely, and then we can satisfy ourselves with other things as well, and to be like in alignment.
I thought it was really like eye-opening the progression of like how democracy leads to the idea of equality, and then equality kind of leads to all religions are like true and the pantheistic mindset, and then because of that people don't like, care that much and hold religion loosely, and then everybody becomes their own god and like relativism takes over, and like how scary that is, but how that's like happened, and then how we all become like sheep to the shepherds of government. It's all like I don't know, like super scary.
Oh, it is. It is scary. And it's scary because it resonates so much. I think it resonates now more than it did in the 1830s. I think when he came out with the book, a lot of people thought he was absurd. This was never going to happen. I think the aristocracies of Europe said democracy was never going to happen. And I think that the Americans who read it said, this isn't going to happen in our country.
I think it just like puts me in really good perspective on what the world we're going to be going into after this year. I think I've heard a lot, like some like Rick said it, especially on our graduation day, like when we took over church, was kind of just like we're taking these 9 months here to like step out of that world to come here and build the foundation of faith, but now it's kind of coming back to we're going to be going into the real world, and like how can we be a healthy change or like a healthy mindset into a pretty scary, individualized world, I guess.
Mhm. No, I want you all to be prepared for this place. So I haven't pulled any punches. I haven't held back from you. And I believe in the power of Jesus Christ. I believe that Jesus is ultimately going to come, and he's going to come in victory. And he's going to come back and take over the world. And we're going to be made anew. But you are going to be leaving here, and you are going to be going out into the world, and you're going to be going out into a world that is ultimately based on public opinion. It's based on the majority, and it's pantheistic. It's believing that all religions are true, and it's going to be a question about whether you can retain your saltiness.
I think, especially these last few
I think the final battle of the transgender movement is going to be on whether biological men can participate in women's sports. If that's ultimately allowed, I think that the transgender movement's going to win. If it's not allowed, I don't think they'll win. And so I would say that that's the battlefield. And I would say that my students at St. Anselm are generally opposed to biologically born men participating in women's sports, which I take to be a positive thing. So I would say that your generation is opposed to that.
Why do you think that's the linch point of it's gonna?
Because I think that if people born male are allowed to participate in women's sports, I think that it's going to be hard for our culture to say no to any other aspect of the transgender movement because of the I. Every individual gets to define their reality for themselves. And so that's why I think that's going to be the final battle of that. And right now I'm optimistic, but it's probably because I'm a Christian. I think we're called to be optimistic. We're called to be realistic, but I think we're called to be hopeful.
Do you think that our culture and like society will ever want to have like the want for philosophy again? Because like I don't know if you read Freedom 451, but like sometimes it kind of feels like that, where all of our information is sort of unfiltered, and like some people do have the want for philosophy and education and knowledge, but like a good majority doesn't really have like the longing to learn anymore. Kind of like Grace was saying, and like, do you think that there'll ever be like a revival of like education?
I hope so, but I'm pessimistic about it. I think liberal arts colleges are in deep trouble, and it's because they're not practical. And so St. Anselm, we've been able to maintain our student body, but a lot of our fellow schools haven't, and there's more and more going out of business. Okay, so I really hope you come at 4 o'clock for my sermon, because it's my commencement gift to you all. So thank you. We'll see you.